Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Regulatory Transparency Project webinar titled, Can the President Shut Down the Department of Education? We are so glad that you're able to join us today. My name is Sarah Clark, and I am the Assistant Director with the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. As a reminder, all opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not of the Federalist Society. We are honored to be joined by a fantastic panel of experts. In order to get right to the discussion, I'll leave individual introduction to our moderator. After the panel discussion, there will be a short period designated for audience questions. We ask you to submit them via Zoom's Q&A feature, not the chat, and that the questions are pertinent to the topic at hand. Our moderator today is Robert Eitel, who is the co-founder and president of the Defense of Freedom Institute. He previously served as senior counselor to the Secretary of Education from 2017 through 2020, and deputy general counsel of the U.S. Department of Education from 2005 to 2009. You can find out more about today's moderator and panelists at fedsoc.org. With that, I will hand things off to Mr. Eitel to get us started. Mr. Eitel, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's a delight to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And I'm pleased that all of you could join us today as we explore the question, can the president shut down the Department of Education? For clarity, this will be a discussion of the legal and policy aspects of dismantling the U.S. Department of Education. So this will not be solely a law-centered discussion. Because we're fortunate to have today four excellent experts in this area that address both the legal and the policy aspects of this issue. Jonathan Butcher, Michael Petrilli, David Randall, and Kent Talbert. I'll introduce each of them. I'm going to also, after that, sort of set out the context for the current discussion. There's been a lot percolating. I realize that not all of the persons watching this webinar have the time to keep up with this issue. A lot has been happening. I'll sort of set the context in terms of litigation and presidential action and departmental action, and then we'll open it up to opening statements from our panelists, followed by discussion and then Q&A. First up, Jonathan Butcher is the Will Skillman, Senior Research Fellow in Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. He has researched and testified in education policy around the United States, including testimony before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He serves as chair of the South Carolina Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and in 2021, the governor of South Carolina nominated Jonathan to serve on the board of the South Carolina Public Charter School District, a statewide charter school authorizer. Mike Petrilli is the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and an executive editor of Education Next. From 2001 through 2005, he served at the U.S. Department of Education in the George W. Bush administration. David Randall is Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars and Executive Director of the Civics Alliance. He was lead author of the recent NAS publication, Wasteland, the Education Department's Profligacy, Mediocrity, and Radicalism. Kent Talbert, my old boss at the Department of Education, currently serves as an investigative counsel on the U.S. House Committee on Education and Workforce, handling a range of oversight issues involving higher education, parental rights, and other matters. He has previously served as general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education and during the Trump administration as a senior advisor to the Deputy Secretary of Education. So let's turn now to what's been happening litigation and policy-wise concerning efforts by the Trump administration to shut down the Department of Education. I think the first thing you need to realize, I think there's three general items. The first is that on March 11th of this year, the administration announced that the Department of Education would engage in a 50% reduction in force in its workforce. That came as a surprise to many people in this area. And this announcement, this RIF, as you will see, will have an effect upon the ability of the administration to close the Department of Education in litigation that has been subsequently commenced. The second thing that happened was that on March 20th of this year, the president signed EO 14242, Improving Education Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities. And in this EO, the president directed the Secretary of Education, quote, to the maximum extent appropriate and permitted by law, to take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the department and return authority over education to states and local communities. The second aspect of that EO directed, and this is something that's less discussed in connection with this dismantlement EO, was that the secretary was directed to pay special attention to federal civil rights laws as it relates to legal requirements that attach themselves to Department of Education funds and programs, particularly the requirement that any program receiving federal financial assistance terminate illegal discrimination under the label diversity, equity, and inclusion in similar terms and programs promoting gender ideology. So in the CEO, you had a directive from the president to the secretary to the maximum extent appropriate to take steps to facilitate the closure, but also, by the way, to enforce vigorously the civil rights laws of the United States. Subsequent to that, the president in a press conference announced that the federal student loan portfolio would transfer from ED's Office of Federal Student Aid to the Small Business Administration, which again took, I think, many people by surprise, because that is not an issue that authority, that notion, that policy had not been discussed before. A couple months later, on May 22nd, a collection of states and school districts sued the department, alleging that the RIF that I referenced before was actually a pretext for dismantling the Department of Education, on the theory that the RIF would make it impossible for the department to perform its statutory obligations, and that the RIF was a step toward a de facto dismantlement. Ultimately, the plaintiffs managed to convince the court that the administration was leveraging the RIF to dismantle the department without congressional authorization. The court, for a number of reasons, not the least of which was that they found a violation of the separation of powers, and that the department was allegedly acting outside of its scope of statutory authority, issued a preliminary injunction. And the department, as a consequence, has been directed to reinstate the employees that were subject to the RIF and to take steps not to enforce any dismantlement of the department administratively. The administration went to the First Circuit to ask for a stay. That was refused, and I believe that the stay request is now pending before SCOTUS. So with that context, I wanted to recenter the conversation and ask Kent Talbert specifically to talk a little bit about the origins of the department and the statutory authority giving rise to the Department of Education, and specifically the Department of Education Organization Act. Kent, what did Congress do with this legislation that created the department?
Sure, sure, and thanks very much to the Federalist Society for hosting. The department or actually back in 1979, when the Department of Education Organization Act was first enacted, it established the department as an independent cabinet level agency. And that was after many other education functions had been put into law under various statutes over the years. And so, the statute itself, the Department of Education Organization Act itself, included a number of findings. It actually had about 10 findings, which is quite a few. It had 7 purpose statements. And it also had a separate section on federal-state relationships, given the concern of a number of members of Congress and others as well at the time. And so the findings and the purpose statement set up to a degree, what the role should be of the newly established Department of Education. Finding 3, for example, says that parents have the primary responsibility for the education of their children, and states, localities, and private institutions have the primary responsibility for supporting that parental role. And so they right away had a finding associated with parents, again, as they're establishing this new department and peeling off the Bureau of Education from the former Health, Education, and Welfare Department. Finding 4, for example, goes directly to the primary responsibility of education, and that essentially says that the primary public responsibility for education is reserved respectively to the states and the local school systems and other instrumentalities of the states. Again, picking up on state and local government's role that's reserved for them under the Constitution. The purpose statement, also there's a purpose statement that talks about the department being coming into existence to supplement and complement the efforts of states, local school systems, and other instrumentalities of the states and the private sector. And there are also several other entities mentioned, but in essence, that purpose statement, one of the purpose statements, is to supplement and complement what states are doing. And then the last thing, this section on federal-state relationships, again, it's part of the Department of Education Organization Act. It says that the establishment of the Department of Education shall not increase the authority of the federal government over education or diminish the responsibility for education, which is reserved to the states and local school systems and other instrumentalities of the states. And so again, the drafters, the drafters of the act, the legislation, were very concerned about, what is the role of the department to be as a freestanding cabinet level agency. And again, it says the establishment of the Department of Ed shall not increase the authority of the federal government or diminish the responsibility of education, which is reserved to the states. And the law also includes as a rule of construction, which is very relevant, that nothing in the law shall be construed to authorize the secretary or any other officers of the department to exercise direction, control over curriculum or programs of instruction. Again, the writers of the law were laying down some markers as to what is the proper role of the department to be now that, it's coming into existence. In 1980, it was enacted and signed in 1979. But unfortunately, the net result over the nearly 46 years of the department has been the department seems to have veered far afield of these limitations that we see in the findings and in the purpose, and also in the statement about the relationships between the federal government and the states and localities. Also, over the 46 years, the department appears to have increased its authority, and in fact, some would argue has taken on a primary role rather than a supplementary role, and that it's displaced, in effect, what the states are responsible for doing and driving the agenda when it should be the other way around. The other thing is, I think some would argue that the Department of Education Organization Act is fully implemented as of today, 40-something years later. In some respects, the department has ignored the role of parents. Some would say in many respects it's done that. But in short, you know, the review of the Department of Ed Organization Act and its establishment of the department, it really seems to be a question about the governance of education at the federal level and the proper federal role, if any. You know, what should that be? And so it's a very timely issue, and thanks so much for the opportunity to participate.
So in that vein, Jonathan, why don't you give some opening thoughts about all this?
Well, thank you, Robert, and to the Federalist Society for putting on this event, and thanks to my fellow panelists. And I'm sorry to inform you that in any debate, the bow tie always wins. The president's leadership and policies are essential to closing the Department of Education. Now, clearly, the agency was established by statute, and there are parts of education policies that are in law that will need legislative authority for the agency to be closed down. But it simply cannot be done without the vision and leadership that would come from the executive branch. So let me give you 3 quick points here. And first, I'd have to say that I do agree with Kent's comments, especially at the end. And as you'll see from what I'm going to say, my view and really the evidence in policy and in the results of the department are in line with where Kent landed at the end. So first, the president is correct to close the Department of Education or to call for its closure. The RIF, the reduction in force that Robert alluded to in his opening remarks, the executive order, they're all steps in that direction to wind down the agency. The Heritage Foundation has a paper that I co-authored. I'm sure that we can make available to everyone via the chat or otherwise about how the agency would be not just wound down, but that parts of it should be kept and then moved to other departments that are better suited. So, for example, the Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education, it would make sense to go to the Department of Justice. Civil rights is essential. No one, conservatives or those on the left, we shouldn't be calling for less civil rights protection, right? We need to be calling it for OCR to be handled in the right agency. NCES, which measures student achievement, many of the same functions are performed by the Census Bureau. It would make sense for the nation's report card to go there. So we have an outline of where these different offices should go, and then the list of offices or parts within the Department of Education that need to be closed. Second, make no mistake, the policy history that Kent just laid out is essential in understanding the department, but don't forget the politics. The U.S. Department of Education was created in agreement with unions. It was a deal. They made a deal with the unions to create this agency. It allowed the teachers' unions to have better access to federal money and advocating for programs and in perpetuity, essentially, calling on taxpayers to pay for special interests. That's why it was created. The sheer number of federal activities, and I'm going to quote here from a report that's about more than 20 years old now, that was a review of the department back then. The sheer number of federal activities had, quote, actually led to a cottage industry in selling information on program descriptions, application deadlines, and filing instructions for each of the myriad of federal programs. It created something for people to work on. That's what the agency created. Number 3, the Department of Education, it's not about achievement. So we can talk about student achievement, math scores, reading scores. We can talk about how it hasn't helped, but that's not what the agency was really set up to do. It actually does very little to manage or change the way that student achievement swings across these subjects. However, it does have a lot to do with coercion. So, for example, In 2014, the Department of Education was key under the Obama administration in swinging the way that we deal with student discipline and essentially advocating for a singular view of telling schools they may not discipline students of certain races more than others, right? Which is a slap in the face to how we should understand civil rights law. The same thing goes for national standards, right? Under the Obama administration, they coerced schools with money to adopt national standards under the Common Core. In the last administration, they redefined what sex is in Title IX, right? Without bothering to go through Congress. And what's fascinating is that the same teachers unions who are suing under the lawsuit that Robert just described to stop the Trump administration from closing the U.S. Department of Education, these are the same unions who didn't say boo when the Biden administration wanted to redefine the word sex in civil rights law, which is fascinating that they were so quiet about it. So make no mistake, closing the Department of Education will return authority to the states. This is not an issue of abandoning education. This is about returning it to the place where parents and local educators will have the most autonomy.
Michael Petrilli, I'd like to hear from you about this. So go ahead, please.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks, Bob, and thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. And Jonathan, very nicely done. I am here in some ways to disagree with what Jonathan said, but I think we do agree with many things, which is that there have been some really bad policies coming out of the federal government over the years that have done some harm. That 2014 guidance on discipline, that's something I've written a lot about, and I think it was definitely a big mistake. I think what we have to acknowledge, though, is that like anything else in this life, federal policy can be good, bad, or in between, and it has varied over time. If you go way back to the 1950s and 60s and the age of desegregation, the federal government did a lot of good, and the schools in the South, especially the 60s into the 70s, would not have desegregated as fast without federal policy. And the results were tremendous in terms of both making our schools more integrated, but also in terms of student achievement for African-American kids going way, way up in those years, especially in the South. In the age of No Child Left Behind, in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, in that era when there was a lot of focus on testing and accountability, a lot of leadership from both Democrats and Republicans from the White House, we saw huge gains in student achievement, especially for the lowest income kids, especially for African-American Hispanic kids. And so that was a time when we were rowing in the same direction as a country, and the federal role did some good. And then, like Jonathan said, there's lots of examples of federal policy doing harm. So my own take is that for the last decade or so, there's not much of a strong federal role to point to. When No Child Left Behind went away and was replaced with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is coming up on its 10th birthday this December, a lot of the more coercive parts of federal policy went away in terms of how states had to design their accountability systems and the like. So what we're left with is still some spending on education. Certainly these debates Jonathan mentioned that relate to the Office for Civil Rights and how we interpret some of the anti-discrimination laws. And my take is that it's, the federal government's not doing much harm in education anymore, but it's also not doing a whole lot of good in education anymore. And so it's a tool. It is a tool that can be used for good or for harm. And right now it's not being used for much of either. So look, the administration is clearly serious about trying to eliminate the Department of Education. They have said they will, however, not eliminate the federal role in education. They've expressed support, for example, for the big Title I program that supports K through 12 education. They want to move things around. I think that's a nothing burger. I think that's not going to, again, make much difference in the real world of schools and classrooms. If anything, it might make life a little bit more difficult for people at the state and local level that now have to deal with even more federal agencies than they do today. But if you're looking to improve student achievement, to improve our schools, to reform the school system, I think, number one, we shouldn't look to Washington. And number two, we shouldn't expect this activity around the Department of Education to do a whole lot to help or hinder that cause. The actions at the state and local level. Unfortunately, at the state and local level, at least in blue states, is where the teachers unions are the strongest. And that is where the real effort's got to be. This is mostly a sideshow. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. David, opening
Thank
comment.
you. Well, thank you so much, Bob. Thank you to the Federalist Society. On the direct question of whether the Trump administration can close down the education department by executive order, the answer is God bless them. Hope they can. And if they can't, then we need to think about the plan B. And I guess I want to say it's always been a question whether you could do it by executive order alone. NAS is basically been saying it's surer to go by statutory reform in the long run. So if it doesn't work out by executive order, that's always the thing to focus on. I guess I would say that our general focus is to make sure that this substance of education reform, you follow through in all the details and don't let bad stuff continue, even if the education department has been formally closed. So that would mean we think it's terribly important to remove the statutes authorizing an awful lot of the small programs from the education department, because the lack of accountability is directly the result of there being so many dozens of programs, you can't figure out what they do. And then every single one of these programs can then be a tie for some sort of regulatory shenanigans from the OCR. It's the sheer complexity of it that makes it an unaccountable bureaucracy. So we're very strongly in favor of concentrating on statutorily removing all of this, as many small programs as you can, and making that a priority. We're then also worried the fat transplant problem. What happens if you shut down the Department of Education, but every little bureaucratic program simply continues doing the same thing in the Department of Health and Human Services, in the Justice Department, and so on? Frankly, the reduction in force answered that a great deal, but that's also being challenged by in the courts. So we can't at this point tell if that will stick. And I guess I just say it's very important to make sure that the little evil-doing bureaucratic cells don't continue somewhere else. Another big thing, watch out for the unfunded mandates. In particular, I'm thinking about special education IDEA. There are these extraordinarily expensive, intrusive, unfunded mandates in special education. The federal government doesn't have to spend a dime itself, but prompted by lawsuit, the school districts and the states are responsible for an enormous amount of spending, which is just growing and growing and growing, like every day. And I want it to be sure that education reformers make sure that Congress doesn't think its job is done if it shuts down the Department of Education. I want Congress to feel responsibility about not shunting off expensive liabilities, undefined liabilities, to the states and the localities. And the last thing is actually a little counter to this, and I must say this is obviously a great deal of policy. The Trump administration is using the powers of the education department to finally, wail on Harvard, but generally to try to address all of the distributed illiberal bureaucracies that have sprung up, in every state, in every locality, in every private institution. And we need the Department of Education is doing a good thing with that, and we need to make sure that if the Department of Education goes away, that the power to confront the distributed authoritarian liberal bureaucracies still that this can be done somewhere in the federal government, Justice Department, elsewhere. Now that's it.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. Ken, I want to return the conversation just to the sort of the direct legalities of this issue of the president dismantling the Department of Education. You mentioned the Department of Education Organization Act, and I do think that that is sort of the central reference point for the legal discussion. The DO, as it's known, has some fairly clear statutory mandates that there will be a Department of Education. That's the determination made by Congress, and that this Department of Education will have within it shall have certain offices. It shall have a deputy secretary. It shall have various offices. Could you comment on that a little bit, sort of walk people through exactly what is required statutorily? And because I think that shows that this is not simply a magic wand exercise where the president dictates that there not be a department and we're done. There are statutory requirements and there are appropriations that accompany that. Would you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. Yeah. So the Department of Ed Organization Act, it sets up the framework for the department, that there shall be a secretary, there shall be a deputy secretary, for example, and there shall be assistant secretaries. It also sets up the different offices within the department: elementary, secondary, post-secondary ed, and many others. It also gives a hand to the department to exercise some discretion in additional officers that they wish to have. But you're correct. The statute does talk about the framework and saying there shall be this office, that office within the department, that sort of thing. In response to the question of the question presented, can the president shut down the Department of Education? The answer is yes, but not without the involvement of Congress. And so to completely disband the department would require an amendment or amendments to the Department of Education Organization Act. The department and the Secretary of Education have indicated their willingness to work with Congress to achieve their goals, and to do that, whether it's downsizing or whether it's complete closure. They've communicated their willingness to work with Congress and Chairman Wahlberg of the Committee on Education and the Workforce, on which I work, has communicated his interest and the committee's interest in working with the secretary and with the department. And so it would indeed require legislation. But in addition, there are other authorities apart from the Department of Education Organization Act. There's interpersonnel agreements. There are other provisions that give some flexibility to the department and how it operates and administers and manages its day-to-day affairs. So there's still some things the president can do without statutory change.
Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute, but I wanted to ask Jonathan. Jonathan, if to Mike's point, if into the point of the executive order, which appears to state that appropriations will continue, if we're going to dismantle the department and simply spread various offices to different agencies or departments within the department, and the appropriations on federal appropriations for these educational programs continue, well, why does it matter? I mean, what are we achieving?
Well, first, the point that you make about the appropriations continuing is an important piece of this lawsuit, because they do intend and understand that the agency will remain open until they can have legislative help in closing the department. But secondly, no, once the president and Congress work together on a proposal to wind down the department, they're not going to keep everything. No, they shouldn't, right? Things like Title II, which is for teacher training, even those who advocate for teacher training under Title II. Look, if you read the reports about the evaluations of this, even they admit that the program doesn't work. They just call for more money to keep it working. Title III, which is money for students who don't speak English as a first language, that needs to be cut. I mean, you can go on down the list of various programs that should be closed. Some of the essential ones that I said should remain are just that. I mean, they are essential, from OCR to the nation's report card, but it's a pretty short list. And I'll say something that, people really need to pay, they may chuckle at, but we are talking about closing the Department of Education, and we're closer to it today than we perhaps ever have been. And so what I'm going to say is even the student loan program, right? Eventually that, should move to whether it's SBA or Treasury. And then we should get Washington out of the business of being the #1 provider of student loans across the country. So that is a huge program, right? Biggest responsibility within the department now, even that. So it's not just a matter of taking programs and moving them around. And take some of them, take the essentials and move those, but then close the rest. Say very quickly, per Michael's point about the good that was done in the 1950s and 60s around civil rights, agree completely. But I would add those were done without a U.S. Department of Education, right? By the same token, to David's comment about the deal that's going on with how the president is using the Department of Education to take on universities. This is resulting in lawsuits, right? Harvard has already turned around and sued. Eventually, this needs to be handled by the Department of Justice, or it will need to be handled in court. You don't need a Department of Education to do this long term. So it's serving a purpose right now. It's not one that it will need to serve forever. So, I mean, look, I would agree with Michael's point finally that, when it comes to improving student achievement, which is that's the bottom line of every conversation, right? Or at least it should be when it comes to K-12. We shouldn't look to Washington. We should be looking to the states that are creating school choice programs that are available to every child, right, across the state. Texas just did that. New Hampshire just did that again, even after we had West Virginia, Arizona, Florida. I mean, we can go down the list of state lawmakers that have created expansive private learning options on top of, in many cases, the charter school options already available in states across the country. Those things, that is the future of education policy. That is what is going to move the needle for student achievement.
Michael, do you have a response to any of that?
No, I mean, look, I think we mostly agree here. And I think we should talk a little bit about, what we should be rooting for here, right? It's a lot of political capital that the administration is investing in this effort to try to break up the Department of Education. And look, I think some of us are a little bit surprised. I'll admit that I am. I thought that, like in the first term, this might be something they talk about a little bit and then quickly move past and go about their business, because it's so hard to do. Because it does appear, again, I'm not the lawyer on the panel, but it appears that you really need Congress to do most of this. And what do you get for it? Even if you succeed and you dismantle the Department of Education, most polls show that this isn't particularly popular. This isn't a hugely winning issue. Maybe it's popular with some parts of the president's base. But, at the end of the day, it's not like it then leads to more options for kids or better schools or improved student achievement. If it does that, it would be very indirect. So, I think there is this question about why is the administration so focused on it? I guess give them credit for trying to follow through on a campaign promise. But I would argue that some of this political capital could be spent in better ways. I would like to see more attention being given, as Jonathan said, to improving student achievement. Could we hear more from the Secretary of Education and from her top deputies about what it's going to take right now to address the country's learning loss, which is still immense after the pandemic and after the teachers' unions kept our schools closed for so long. Again, if this is just a whole lot of work and political capital for not much gain, you can ask, what could that investment be better used for?
Although I would say that she has spoken out in favor of students, furthering student achievement and workforce development, and things that are not necessarily on the front page of the paper, right? I mean, she has spoken on those issues. It's the other stuff that perhaps is sort of the bright, shiny object of the day, the DEI, the gender ideology stuff, but all of which is very important, gets most of the press. But in fairness to her, she has spoken about that. David, you mentioned. Let me ask you this. You've done a lot of work at sort of reimagining how all this would work in terms of federal education policy and where programs would go, those which would be terminated. Could you talk a little bit about the work you've done in that regard and sort of outline for us and your thinking on if there's not going to be an education department, then how's federal education policy going to work and where would these programs go, if anywhere?
Oh, golly. So all workforce education, the Department of Labor, everything having to do with Indian education, there's an entire duplicate bureaucracy within the Department of Education and within the Department of Interior. Merge everything which is being done in the Department of Education over to the Department of the Interior. Arts education can go to the National Education of the Arts. The Institute for Education Statistics, which is, by the way, yes, really important, not least because state assessments of their own progress can be a little dodgy, and it's good to have the federal information as a double check on that. We were saying I think the NSF has a social sciences, the National Science Foundation has a social sciences directorate, perhaps that instead of the Census Department. I should say, however, the Health and Human Services, an enormous amount. The rehabilitative services, we at least a dozen things. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So special education to HHS, that sort of thing.
And I should say there's also there's simplifications which don't necessarily wherever they're done. For example, Title I spending now has, I think, 4 different formula programs which have been added over the years. This should be amalgamated. There should be one formula spending program, and again, for accountability, so that citizens and lawmakers can know precisely how this darned machine works. The more moving parts you have, the less democratic accountability you have. So it's reform within, as well as, yes, slicing things to go to every other. Hey, look, the Defense Department has its own education system. They should have full control over that. We're still doing stuff for federated states of Micronesia. I sort of think that could go to the State Department at this point. Sorry, it will take me the next half hour to do everything.
Sure.
That makes sense.
Sure. Ken, I wanted to ask you, so we've talked briefly about DOA and the statutory requirements, and there are some fairly specific mandates to the executive branch by Congress on how to administer the programs and what offices exist. What give is there within the joints of not just the Department of Education Organizational Act, but federal law generally for the administration to disband a particular office within the department or to use certain types of agreements with other agencies for those agencies to perform the tasks of the education department? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's several different authorities that the Department of Ed and indeed federal agencies in general can rely upon if they wish to have, for example, interagency agreements with other departments or agencies to do certain common tasks or share in particular projects. For example, the General Education Provisions Act has language in it, and that's one of the laws that provides for the administrative kinds of things that the department does as it goes about its business. But there's a provision that allows for agencies to share in projects of common interest where they sign these memorandum of understanding or other agreements where they agree to do things of common interest. There's the Economy Act, which allows for the purchase of goods and services, for example, by one department or agency from another, and to work out an agreement to do that. There's even a separate provision in the Department of Education Organization Act, but it's very constrained. There are a number of strings and limitations attached to it, but there is some flexibility within the DEOA. And then there are statutes that deal with personnel and the Intergovernmental Personnel Act, which allows for detailing and transfer of employees between agencies, that kind of thing. So there is flexibility. The court in Massachusetts, which is the plaintiffs there have challenged what the department is seeking to do. They've taken issue with the department carrying out its essential functions and that kind of thing, but rightly structured agreements with other agencies can be a way to move things around, to share in common functions, activities, that kind of thing.
And it's interesting to note that in that Massachusetts case, there are filings that have been recently made from the department which indicate that the education department is indeed using interagency agreements in a limited way to operationalize this notion of dismantlement, and specifically but that has been enjoined by the court. But it's interesting to note that the department has attempted to do this in two ways. One, in relation to the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, which administers sort of the mostly post-secondary grant programs relating to technical and adult education, that they have entered into an IA with I think the Department of Labor to perform certain tasks or to manage certain programs formerly managed by the Department of Education, and that they've entered into an interagency agreement with the Treasury Department, I believe, for collections work, which actually is not unusual. That has happened in the past, I believe, well into the 21st century. That was a model wherein the Education Department would agree with the Treasury Department to institute collections work on the federal student loan defaults. But it's interesting to note that all that's been enjoined. I mean, that is stopped, and the court has stopped all that in its tracks. So that, I think, bears watching up the road. We have some questions, and I thought we'd get into those now. The first question relates to returning education authority to the states. What are the implications of returning education authority to states and parents for school choice and parental rights? Will eliminating the education department accelerate trends like the expansion of ESAs, charter schools, and the like? Thoughts on that, Mike? I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, I'll go first on this one. Look, again, I think it depends. We have to clarify, are we talking about getting rid of the federal role or getting rid of the Department of Education, right? So if the programs and policies stay but go elsewhere, nothing much really changes in the real world. I do think if you got rid of the big programs, so for K-12, you got rid of Title I and all of the requirements that came along with that, it would be significant. It would mean less spending, obviously, but it would also, for example, remove the current requirements for annual testing in grades 3 through 8 in reading and math. a requirement that I would argue still is important to have some transparency in our public education system to know how things are going. I'd also say on the charter school front, the federal government has actually been very constructive on charter schools, going way back to the Clinton administration, providing grants, startup grants for brand new charter schools before they open their doors and can start receiving state and local money. I think there's no doubt we would have many fewer charter schools today if we didn't have that seed money. And so that's another important one. But beyond that, you go down the list and you say, look, most of the action still is at the state and local level. I mean, if you're an education reformer, to spend most of your time out in the state capitals, because that is where the real decisions get made. As Jonathan said, states like Texas passing big school choice programs. What I don't know is whether a change to the federal role would spark more school choice necessarily. I don't. If there's a connection there, I think it's quite indirect. It's more hope over experience. What matters for school choice is whether advocates can win these fights at the state capital level.
Let me ask you, there's a question here about if education is shifted to the states, how will they fund education? Will the federal government provide funds that the states need to help fund education? I think we could probably discuss here, what is the amount of federal aid in K-12? I mean, what are we looking at?
For K-12, it's about 10 cents on the dollar. Okay, so 10% of the money is coming from the federal government. It was more than that in some times of emergency, like after the COVID pandemic, and there's a huge influx of spending, but about 10%. And so now that's not spread around evenly. In higher poverty districts, they get more money, and so it would be a bigger loss. You can find school districts where get 15, even 20% of their dollars from the federal government. And that money, it's depending on how you study, it's hard to study. That money kind of gets lumped in with everything else. If that money went away overnight, you would notice, and it would probably do some real harm because our school system is terrible at reducing costs in a positive way. That said, most of the money, again, 90% of the money is coming from state and local sources. And so the federal government has often been the tail that wags the dog. It really is not the major player, at least in K-12 education.
So let me ask this, maybe Ken, I'll open this up to all of you. Can the reconciliation process be used to abolish the department? Any thoughts on that? We have a question in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the House did not pursue that. We primarily pursued changes in the higher education space to achieve savings that could then be used for extension of the tax code changes so that those do not or did not disappear. Whether the Senate chooses to do anything on that is an open question. My sense is that there's enough otherwise associated with extending the tax provisions and achieving savings to do that it would probably not get touched on or dealt with on the Senate side.
So one question here is, if the Department of Education goes away, who would be in the best position to administer the Pell Grants program? Is that a job for Treasury? Is it a job for SBA or someone else? David?
Well, that was actually something we thought was frankly better to just stick with education for the moment. Okay, I must say, the Heritage Project 2025 wanted a completely autonomous agency in charge of distributing all such monies, all undergraduate loans and grants, to prevent a redo of the pretty darn criminal actions by the Biden administration. I must say that strikes me as a good idea. The question we want now is not who will administer it most efficiently itself, but who will be immune from maladministration by a future Biden-esque administration. So whoever it should be, it should have the maximum autonomy and the maximum guidelines to make sure that things are done legally.
So just in that vein, I'd like to stress that much of this discussion about diminishing the federal role in education and dismantling the Department of Education generally kind of overlooks the federal student aid component of this. And certainly within conservative libertarian circles, there's a consensus that certainly on K-12 there should be a devolution to the states on these issues, and a less of a department role, if any. But on the higher ed side of things, when it comes to federal support for federal student loans and Pell Grants, there seems to be a consensus that the reality is that program's not going to go anywhere. And the question then becomes, if you're not going to have an education department, where does it go? And David, you touched on this idea of an independent agency, which frankly is an idea that we at the Defense of Freedom Institute have pushed since our days working for Betsy DeVos in the education department. Others have advocated that Treasury would be the best vehicle. I happen to think that would be other than for collections, a very poor site for federal student aid activity. Does anybody have any thoughts on this issue before we wrap up? We have a few more minutes, and I'd like to give an opportunity for brief closing statements as well.
I want to push back against that consensus, actually. There may be a consensus that it's difficult to do, but the National Association of Scholars is certainly on board that we should get rid of most federal student federal aid. The vast majority is simply captured by university administrations. It's not really helping the students at all. It's, if anything, supercharging student debt. And I guess I'd say, if you're going to include it at all, it's absolutely vital to make colleges be co-responsible for student debts, to align college interests with student interests, and not just have the colleges and universities be raiding the federal government and the taxpayer for more money. So I just want to say, we're certainly in favor of something being done, whether or not we think the federal government is going to do it anytime soon.
Understood. So we have a few minutes. Let's have some quick 30-second closings on this. Jonathan?
Thank you. So I agree, and thanks to David for a shout out to Heritage Research on the issue of higher ed. And it is true, as Michael was saying, that the school choice developments that we've seen in the last going on 30 plus years have come from states, often I would say, because in spite of what Washington has done to either regulate private schools or otherwise make it difficult to have school choice programs. So I think that closing the Department of Education isn't going to help nor hinder necessarily. Well, it'll certainly help the growth of private school choice, because there will not be regulations from Washington that schools need to be looking over their shoulders about who private schools may or may not have to accept. And I would just reemphasize, most of the money, 90+% of per student funding, comes from state and local taxpayers. And Mike was right. It's not evenly dispersed. Those areas that have higher levels of poverty do get more, but they also happen to be the urban areas like LA, Chicago, New York, Miami, etc., that tend to have low performing schools. So money, and increased federal money, is not associated with improved student achievement. So we need to be looking to good policy, and closing the department is the first one.
Michael, real quick.
I should really just stop with Jonathan telling me that I'm right. I love that. I think, no, thanks, Jonathan. But no, I think what folks listening should really pay attention to, other than these debates going on, is the annual appropriations process. That is where Congress gets to decide how much to spend on these big programs and those, dozens and dozens, as David said, of little programs. And it's our chance every year to try to chisel away at that federal role and try to make sure that it's, if we're going to do things from Washington on education, that they are things that are targeted and that are actually making a difference for kids.
David?
That two things that you want to reduce that federal role in education above all. That does matter more than the sheer name of the Department of Education. But we can't get there if there's a third rail, and we can't even think about things like getting rid of the Department of Education, and we can't even think of firing a single federal bureaucrat there. That makes it impossible for there ever to be reform. The current attempt makes it thinkable. It's shifted that Overton window, and it puts everything on the table. God bless them for trying. I hope they succeed. And even if they don't succeed immediately by this means, they've really made closing the Department of Education thinkable and politically feasible, as I don't think it would have been if they hadn't made the effort.
And Ken?
Yeah, three things. One, there's been some discussion about the federal support of education is only 10% in terms of money. That's true, but there are a multitude of regulations, guidance documents, sub-regulatory guidance that then direct states and school districts on what they need to do, and that has become a problem over time. Secondly, we talked about federal student aid, whether that goes to SBA or Treasury. I'll say there is strong support in Congress for federal student aid. And as we're talking about reconciliation, there were a number of important policy changes that were made and that hopefully will be a part of the final reconciliation bill. So again, there's strong support. I think the federal student aid role will continue. And then lastly, back to the Department of Education Organization Act where we began, the intent was that the federal involvement be supplementary to states. Over the 40 plus years, it seems to have become shifted to the primary rather than supplementary role. And again, the enabling statute set things up so that states and local communities, it acknowledged that they are the primary drivers of education and not the federal government.
Perfect. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Appreciate your time. Sarah, to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Eitel, for moderating, and thank you again to everyone on our panel for joining us and for sharing your insights today. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in and for your questions. For more content like this from the Regulatory Transparency Project here at the Federalist Society, please visit us at riseproject.org. Thank you.